As Guyana prepares for one of its most consequential general and regional elections, the stakes are high, and so are the concerns. On this edition of Sources, we take a closer look at the preparation on the way and the growing concerns being raised on both sides of the political aisle. The government maintains that the Guyana Elections Commission, GCOM, is well equipped to deliver free and fair elections by September 1, but the opposition remains unconvinced, calling for the introduction of enhanced biometrics at polling stations, a clean voters list, and greater transparency from the Elections Commission. At the heart of these debates lies a critical question. Can Guyana ensure a credible electoral process in time? Joining us now is one of the key voices in the national discourse, opposition-nominated GCOM Commissioner Vincent Alexander, who has been outspoken on electoral reform, voter verification, and the urgent need to rebuild institutional trust. This is Sources, bringing you the issues, the facts, and the people behind them. Good evening and welcome to Sources. I'm your host, Svetlana Marshall. Tonight, we'll be talking about the 2025 general and regional elections set for September 1. And to discuss this very important topic with me tonight, I have Guyana Elections Commission Commissioner, Mr. Vincent Alexander, a very long-standing commissioner, I must say. Mr. Alexander, thank you so much for being here once again on the program.
Thank you very much for having me.
Mr. Alexander, the general elections is taking place constitutionally, rightfully so, 5 years after the highly controversial 2020 elections. Do you think that the Guyana Elections Commission has done enough to address the challenges that arose during that election?
You refer to the 2020 elections as highly controversial. And you're quite right. Mm-hmm. But there are those who like to be one-sided on the question of the controversy. Very little is said about the fact that we could not authenticate the ballots in 49 boxes on the East Coast, an area which was politically under the control of Anil Nandalal. Secondly, the APNU challenged votes cast in the names of persons who were overseas. The Chief Immigration Officer responded to an initial number of those challenges, indicated that about 80% were not indeed present. The rest, which were in the thousands, were corralled by Nandalal, indicating that he would have that verified and that he was assured that it would show that the PNC had falsified the information. 2 years have passed and he's not come back to us. So yes, the elections were controversial, and the controversy is clearly across the board. But action in response to the controversy has been highly one-sided.
Okay. And when you say one-sided, you're referencing to the fact that a lot of people, mainly government people, would reference to the variation, the results initially declared on the 5th and the 13th of March 2020, and the results that were actually declared by GCOM following the general recount. And I know that matters in court, but to respond.
Yes, so the fingers are pointed to one set of people, some GCOM officials and some APNU people, and they kind of put them together as if they're one side. And these are the issues, particularly what Nandalal has done in corralling that information, obviously is on the other side.
Okay. And now that matter with regards to the variation is now in court and it has been ongoing for some time. So we leave it there and we'll address what GCOM has done, because you sit on the Guyana Elections Commission. You've been one of the longest serving member of the commission. What has been done by GCOM since 2020 to really address the challenges that arose?
GCOM has refused to review the operations of Elections 2020 in a manner that is normal for any project. Any project, one would, after the project, do an evaluation to see if you achieved what you set out to do, if there were systemic problems, so that you can correct those things. GCOM refused to have that review.
Okay.
If GCOM had had that review, many of the things which we are now trying to push for would have been brought up or unearthed, and GCOM would have been able to put itself in a real state of preparedness between 2020 and now. You have a letter in the newspaper in which one Mr. Rui contends that one of the obstacles that we are placing before GCOM is that they must be reviewed before the elections. We have not raised the question of a review as a prerequisite for these elections. We've raised the question of GCOM refusing to do a review in relation to the elections. And we have now put other issues, we've put issues on the table, so we're not demanding the review. He's attempted to say that we're obstructionists because we're demanding a review of the 2020 elections at this time. We have seen what they've done with that. We have taken issues and put them on the table. I'm not demanding a review, but he's prepared to lie and fool the public in an attempt to distract from what GCOM is not doing and to distract from what GCOM ought to be doing.
What are some of the systemic issues that arose during the election that you thought ought to be addressed?
The systemic issues, which didn't necessarily arise during these elections, but they are systemic issues in terms of GCOM's operations that would have impacted this last elections and any elections are, for example, polling day agents of political parties are not granted certificates of employment, which means that if a party has to send a polling agent to work in an area where he or she is not registered, that polling agent has two options: either to not vote or to leave his or her post to go somewhere else to vote and to have that area not policed, so to speak. Transport workers, GCOM workers, they're all granted certificates of employment. If we are of the view that the Constitution specifies and the judge has made it pellucid that every Guyanese, once he or she has reached the age of 18 and registered, should be allowed to vote, then not to grant these workers certificates of employment to vote at the place where they're working is an act of disenfranchisement. So that's one of the issues. I want to make this point. In the last elections in which Boodoo participated, we were having a discussion on this same issue. Because there was one time, with the same laws in place, when political workers were granted certificates of employment. We were having discussions on this matter. Boodoo was advised to cease granting those certificates pending a determination of the matter. And he said to us that he had done so. Election day, I was able to discern evidentially that the PPP workers at the Alexander Village Nursery School were granted certificates of employment. This is evidentially I did that, and I brought it to the attention of GCOM. On the same occasion, I then called to identify what was happening. And over 50 PPP workers were granted certificates. No one else was granted. And Boodoo went scotch-free. Unlike these people who are now being charged, Boodoo went scotch-free, having clearly defied, in the favor of a party, GCOM's decision. So that's one. The other one is the whole question of the people who are incarcerated. Again, I rely on the Constitution that bequeaths every Guyanese the right, once of age and registered, to vote. The prisoners are not allowed to vote. And among those persons are the remanded. So these are persons who have not even been found guilty of anything. We have raised this matter. Let it be resolved that these persons are allowed to vote. They're putting obstacles in the way, all sorts of silly arguments about security and all of that. But this is a right which is being denied. Now, this is a matter that is not local, it's international. In the British Parliament, this matter was discussed. And in the British judicial system, it was determined that incarcerated persons should be allowed to vote. They're pushing back on that. The latest thing they have done is to say they're going to write the AG for an opinion in the matter. Now that is extremely ironical because we know where the AG stands in relation to the various parties. And therefore any matter coming out of the APNU, AFC, so to speak, we know what the response has been and what the response will be. But having ditched a professional legal advisor, a legal officer, they are now turning to the AG, who is undoubtedly partial on these political matters. So that's the second one. The third one has to do with, and this actually occurred, the stamping of ballots. The law requires that each ballot should have a GCOM stamp at the back. Each ballot meaning the ballot for regional elections and the ballot for general elections. There are two ballots, but initially they are on one sheet of paper. And so what is supposed to be done, the officials are supposed to stamp at the top, which should go onto the general, and stamp at the bottom, which will go onto the regional. When we come to count, those ballots are separated. Now what occurred is that there are instances when the stamp is not placed on one half of that sheet of paper. And the half on which it is not placed, that ballot is not counted. Our contention is that the extent to which it is one sheet of paper and the extent to which the stamp is on one half, it is clear that the other half is equally authentic, and therefore, at the point of counting and separation, that should also be stamped and or counted. They're pushing back on that again. And what these people are using is the argument that the law doesn't provide for this. Laws are not perfect, and if we discern flaws in the system, we should seek to have those laws corrected. But they are falling back on laws that clearly are not resolving the problems that confront us as the basis for not correcting a visible problem. In addition to that, so that's the third issue I've raised. The fourth issue would be the question of domicility. Imagine in the recent amendments to the law, they have inserted domicility as an aspect of what the Commonwealth citizens should meet, a requirement they should meet to be able to vote. They have, the government in its amendments have put that in. Now, so it now says the persons must be resident and domicile. They haven't defined domicility in the law. And so we are saying, look, all right, we've always used 1 year residency, but now the law provides for domicility. What does this mean? And domicility definitionally means that the person must exhibit the intent to be resident, to make Guyana his or her homestead. And we are contending that in that circumstance, the person must have lived here for more than a year, 2 to 3 years, showing the intent to remain here. That again, they're blocking. They sent it for advice to the Attorney General, who said, continue with the old system, and does not address the question of domicility, which he himself is the author of in new legislation. So that's about the fourth issue I've raised.
Well, let me interject here. You've highlighted a number of issues, but there have also been some legislative changes that government thought piloted through the House and eventually passed. With respect, for example, with the Representation of the People's Act, there were several amendments. And recently in Parliament, the Attorney General, Mr. Anil Nandlal, indicated that there were over 100 amendments made to strengthen the electoral system. One such system that is being introduced is the use of supernumerary officers. What's your take on the legislative changes? Do you think it will help?
I want to make 2 points there. He said 100 amendments. That 100 is like the 200 GRA taxes that he said the previous government had introduced. They have a serious problem with counting. A serious problem with counting. So I challenge this argument of 100 amendments. With specific reference to the supernumerary officers, they have only put into law what, for all intents, GCOM had started practicing prior.
Okay.
So GCOM had already done work in terms of North Georgetown, in terms of South Georgetown, in terms of East Coast, in terms of East Bank. We had already moved in the direction of giving some autonomy to those operations. We have no problem with those amendments because, in fact, they are a progression on what GCOM itself had embarked upon prior to 2020. Prior to 2020. So there are some amendments which we have no problems. But even in the case of amendments generally, we have the general problem of incongruence in the way in which our laws are. Incongruence. And so you have some amendments which now fly in the face of other laws, so that we do not have a proper system of the codification and unification of our laws. And as a consequence, there are contradictions in the laws, and preference is shown when these issues have to be resolved to that law or that aspect of the law that represents an interest rather than an attempt to rectify the law. So, for example, this whole court case we had recently, where the AG talked about the whole question of there'd be no need to have identification of the place of residence done, flies in the face, for example, of Article 73 of the law, which specifically specifies that the purpose for regional elections that the people must be known to be resident in that place. And Article 73 is referred in Article 159, which is the kind of anchor law about who's entitled to vote. So you have situations where what is being done and laws which are being passed sometimes fly in the face of the fundamental law of our country.
But the court did rule in favor of the Attorney General and say that because residency is not a requirement, the eligibility is you must be 18 years and older, citizen of Guyana, Commonwealth citizen, and so...
For me, the ruling of the court is highly flawed. It is highly flawed because the court did not in any way reference our Constitution properly. The reference to our Constitution has to start with the principles. And our principles speak to a representative system where people must be able to relate to their representatives. You can't have someone who does not knowingly live in a particular area vote in that area in a system where the people are supposed to relate to their representatives, and it's the people who are relating who should determine who their representatives are. We have a system where you could import people to determine who will be the representative, and I'm speaking here to the constituencies, we have 10 constituencies in national elections. And we have the regions, and we have the local government. So I will contend and boldly say, as I have written, that the decision of the court is highly flawed. And the court did not take into consideration the relationship between the principles in our Constitution, Article 157, 159, Article 73, and other articles. And you have this joker, Rui, writing recently that we want local government laws to apply to national elections. There are some laws that we apply to elections, period. And when you talk to Article 73, it's about local government insofar as it's regional elections. And when you look at the constituencies we have at national elections, of course, the relationship between the elector and the electorate is no different from what occurs in local and regional elections.
Well, the court has ruled. It is...
I think that matter has been appealed.
It is being appealed. Moving on, the president announced that elections would be held on September 1. He did so based on the advice of the chairman of the Guyana Elections Commission, Justice Retired Claudette Singh. I know there was a controversy over whether Justice Singh had acted unilaterally, and in fact she said in a statement, or GCOM in a statement said that she had garnered the advice of the Chief Elections Officer, Mr. Vishnu Prasad. The Commission has moved on since, am I correct?
The Commission has retroactively endorsed her advice on a majority vote. But the fact of the matter is that she was unilateral. She cannot tell us that she consulted with the Chief Elections Officer and did, without any reference to the Commission, which is a constitutional body, on these matters, and call that consultations. She did not consult. She was unilateral in what she did. And she supposedly consulted with someone who had previously, a matter of days before, advised the Commission in his work plan, which he now says is not a work plan, that the earliest possible date was the 22nd of September. I'm not saying that we would not have arrived at the 1st of September, but I'm saying the manner in which this matter was conducted clearly is in breach of the protocols, the procedures in GCOM, and that though the President has a right to exercise his prerogative, the manner in which he was advised was in breach procedurally, on one hand, and the substance of the advice was in breach of the position GCOM was at the time when the advice was rendered.
Okay. And since that issue, as you said, it was approved retroactively, GCOM has also approved the work plan put forward by the Chief Elections Officer. Are you satisfied with that work plan, and are you convinced that the Commission, the Secretariat, would be able to meet all the statutory timelines?
I can never be satisfied with that work plan, because that work plan rolls back on the best practices in terms of the conduct of elections. So, for example, for claims and objections, we would traditionally have a period of 21 days. Imagine it's now 3 days. And so what we're in fact doing is denying the electorate that scope of involvement and engagement in the preparation of elections. So I've given you just but one example of what has been pushed back. I don't know that they have rectified, even in the plan, the statutory provision that when parties submit their lists and they are not approved, that there should be a 3-day period for appeals. My last reading of the plan, there is still a 1-day period. So again, it's going to affect the parties' engagement in terms of finalizing their nomination lists and their participation in the elections. Too many timelines have been reduced to accommodate September 1 in a circumstance where GCOM was not allowed to interrogate the possibility of September 1 for advice to the president, which has nothing to do with what he decides. What he decides is another matter. But he could have been otherwise advised. He was not otherwise advised, and they have now sought to meet that date that he's announced by contracting a lot of timelines that will impact the level of effectiveness of the delivery of election.
What are the implications for the parties, particularly the newer parties?
The impact on the new parties is the greatest. They are newcomers. There are a lot of other things you have to kind of learn if you get involved in elections. For example, if you are getting involved in elections at the general level, you have to make sure you go there and for your list to get signatures from the citizens. You have to make sure those signatures are of people who are on the list. You have to make sure that you don't have a duplication of signatures between lists. These things have all occurred in the past, but there's some time frame in which they could be rectified. You have to be able to get signatures for the constituencies from 6 regions at minimum. So there are a lot of things that they are on a learning curve that requires time, and the time now given to them is, I would say, highly inadequate for learning and implementation.
And so recently, even as the Commission prepares itself for these elections, the opposition aligned commissioners, yourself included, along with Mr. Trotman and Mr. Corbin, I was told at least 2 of you walked out of the most recent meeting. What was your reason for that? You've been accused of attempting to stall the process.
First instance when we left the meeting was the instance where we were protesting the action of the chairperson, who had acted unilaterally and who refused to accept that in fact she had acted unilaterally and had done a wrong. And we thought we wanted to highlight that and to protest that, and we left that meeting. The second occasion, when the meeting was aborted, she gave an undertaking that outstanding issues which we consider critical to free and fair elections were going to be discussed at the subsequent meeting. We got to the subsequent meeting, they were not on the agenda, and she didn't even start the meeting by explaining why they were not on the agenda. She went straight into discussing the minutes, and we said, no, please stop. Where are these items? She then said, well, you know, the AG is out of the country and therefore don't have a response, and that's why they're not on the agenda. And we said, sorry, we're here to discuss these matters because they're critical to the conduct of free and fair elections. So the work plan you have is one thing, but here are issues. Are we moving towards having the incarcerated vote? We can't wait for election day to make that decision. It has to be made early. Are you waiting? When are you going to decide how we're going to deal with the question of stamping both sides of the ballots? It may be a decision that has to affect the way in which the ballots are printed. We can't wait. These are critical matters. And if you are not prepared to discuss the critical matters, then you're not really prepared to discuss free and fair elections. And we're not a part of that.
One of the issues the opposition aligned commissioners would have pushed for even before the date for election was announced was the issue of the use of enhanced biometrics at polling stations. You, in a sense, the 3 of you were unsuccessful in that regard. I think it reached a stage where it was under consideration. Is that so?
It was under consideration, and we got all sorts of responses. We got responses of it's too late, particularly in relation to the registration aspect, because the biometrics had 2 aspects. It was digital registration. There are no legal or technical impediments to digital registration. And we've gotten to the point where I think the commissioners had to admit that there are no impediments. But they started to say it's too late. Then the question of digital identification at the place of poll. They have put up obstacles in terms of the law and things like that. And so a decision was made, albeit a majority decision, that we can proceed with that now. Now, two things I want to say about that. Though that decision was made, we have a situation where Commissioner Roy goes out in the public media to suggest to the public that that's one of the issues we want resolved before elections. Oh, we wanted it resolved before elections, but we have observed the decision that's been made. We have moved on. And in moving on, we have made the suggestion that what should be occurring now is that they should get the list of the overseas Guyanese and to have those names highlighted. So we are looking at an interim solution to the problem of having people manipulate the list and vote twice. That's one of the outstanding matters that they still are to make a decision on. We are saying, look, there's evidence that people voted twice and that they voted for people who were essentially overseas. Let us find a way to highlight. You haven't given us biometrics. Biometrics would have been perfect because if people come only with fingerprints, then it's difficult for somebody to fraudulently present himself. You haven't given us that. Let's highlight those names so that the people at the polling stations can be vigilant and alert. So if somebody pops up under that name, they will just be more vigilant to make sure it's the right person. That too has been undecided. So you see there are a number of issues that are critical to free and fair elections that are not being addressed.
Now let's talk about the list. The opposition in particular has been calling for what it says it needs a clean voters list. It says that the list is bloated, almost the size of the country's population. And I think the use of enhanced biometric was a way to detect, whether persons are deceased or out of the country. What is the state of the list right now?
There's undoubtedly a problem with the list that has now reached 738,000 people in a country where the last official figures of the entire population was 750. So that list is problematic. It is problematic not only in itself, it is problematic in the context of the fraudulent conduct of elections, because it is the expanded list that is used to facilitate multiple voting. People going to vote for people who are on the list but not present. Now, in the Commission, we have discerned the difficulties in terms of the rule of the court and all of that. And so we've been pragmatic. It is through that pragmatism that we call for biometrics. It is through that pragmatism that when biometrics was not accepted, we have called for underlining the names in the list. So what we're doing, in fact, is identifying the mischief that we want to address and looking for possible solutions. The ultimate solution is a clean list. In the absence of that, because of what the legal system seems to be suggesting and the lack of legislative action, we have moved on to biometrics, we've moved on to underlining names. But you have Commissioner Roy out there saying, well, they want biometrics, so that's what's holding up. That's what's going to hold up the elections. We've gone past that. That guy is so crass in the things he says to the public is unbelievable. Yes, there's need for a clean list. We know what the obstacles are, including the ruling of the court on that matter. And we have been pragmatic to move on to biometrics. Biometrics has not been voted for. We've moved on for this elections to underlining those names, and that too is not being facilitated to date.
Now, the laws also provide for, in the case of persons who are now deceased, to be removed from the list. Don't you think that is sufficient?
It's not sufficient
to address the issue of who should not be on the list?
It's not sufficient for two reasons. It's evidential that in Guyana, all of the dead are not reported to the Registrar General's office. It's evidential. Whether we had Arthur Chung's name, Viola Burnham's name, Mr. Ben's name, all of whom died, were still in the list. It's evidential that the system for removing the names locally does not work perfectly.
Why has
In
GECOM
that
done
regard,
enough to address that?
in that regard, the government has gone to the legislature and provided for something that we had discussed in GCOM, and that is that the police can report on deaths, and the chief medical officer can report on deaths, and that would supplement the report we get from the Registrar General's office. That's now in the law that they pass. They are now pushing back in GCOM on the use of Form 12 as the mechanism for the actualization of that law. So they're actually pushing back on the implementation of a law intended to deal with the mischief of dead people appearing in the list, a law which they passed. And that's another one of the issues still to be determined, but we're rushing towards an election. We're rushing towards an election. So that's the local. But worse than that, from a number perspective, there are tens of thousands of Guyanese registered between 2008 and 2025 who have died overseas. And there is no mechanism presently to remove those names from the list. We don't conduct claims and objections overseas. There's no mechanism. So, that is why we are saying highlight those names of the overseas. Because the highlighted names there will be highlighted names of people who have died. And you don't want somebody to turn up to vote for those persons. So highlight the names. Let's be alert. We need to be alert because the ID cards are not an effective form of identification always. Pictures were taken in 2008. 2008. Those persons are turning up in 2025 with those same pics. And I can tell you, it is clear that that is not the most effective way of identification. And again, why biometrics has become so critical. Because we have refused, as GCOM, to do what we discussed, to have ID cards renewed every 7 years, to have an expiry date in ID cards. Because a period of 7 years, people's facial features can change, and therefore you really can't effectively rely on an ID card for identification purposes. Notwithstanding all that trash they speak about all the mechanisms being in place, you cannot effectively rely on ID cards, and therefore people can go through the system once they bear an ID card that's authentic. But it doesn't mean it is the authentic person bearing the card.
Given the challenges that you just spoke about, how does the Commission move forward as a collective, a united force?
The Commission is not a united force. The Commission is a fractured commission where the PPP nominated commissioners are unequivocal that they are representatives of the PPP and therefore they represent PPP interests.
And they could say the same about the opposition aligned commissioners?
The slight difference for a starter is that the opposition aligned commissioners, as you said, do not articulate their presence in that way. They do not say unabashedly that they are representatives. They project themselves as constitutional officers. So the commitment, at least the articulated commitment of the commissioners are not the same. Their commitment is to represent the PPP. Our commitment is to represent the Constitution. Even if we are not faithful in that, publicly that's our commitment. And one can only look to see the issues which we've raised and how we've raised them to determine whether what we are representing is biased or is objective. We are representing the introduction of a law that they passed on the question of the dead locally. They are not themselves representing that. And therefore one can see that there's some mischief afoot in terms of the things they represent, as they say they represent the People's Progressive Party.
And what would be, what you would like to see happen at the level of commission? What could be done at this late stage to ensure that Guyanese benefit from free and fair elections as they rightfully
Well, I don't
should?
know that much could be done in the level of the commission because the commission clearly is a 4-3 scenario. The chairperson, without rhyme or reason, seems to support whatever comes from the government, and therefore I don't know how much could be done. I think that really there is a political quagmire existing at this point in time, a quagmire which the affected parties have to confront. And I call it a quagmire because the parties are faced with a difficult situation. If you don't contest, then you give up all the political space to people who have demonstrated a desire to occupy that space, even when it's just with 51% of the votes. So should a political party give that up on the position that these elections are not fair? Therefore, to me, it seems that they have to make a decision that as they continue to struggle for changes, they do not give up the political space, but that they have to commit themselves to action in or out of government beyond the elections.
Mm-hmm. What are some, at the electoral level, on E-Day, what could be done by parties? And you have a number of new parties.
Parties have got to be, what is critical on E-Day, parties have got to be super vigilant, so as to ensure that people who are not present are not voted for. That is the mischief we're trying to deal with. So parties have got to be super vigilant in that regard. And all that I've said, the issue we're dealing with is a numbers issue. Elections are about numbers. In our situation, the difference between the parties is not significant in terms of numbers. And therefore, everyone vote in our circumstance. It's not only an entitlement that should prevail, but it's a vote that can make a difference. And therefore, all the things we are talking about, when you look at them carefully, you will see that they speak to the question of numbers. How many people are going to be possibly voting who are not supposed to vote? A numbers issue is the big issue. And so parties have got to be vigilant to keep the numbers on election day to the people who are really entitled to vote.
And what the commissioners would be doing on your side?
We commissioners, we patrol the system. Mm-hmm. We patrol the system, but that's limited. Like the observers, our patrol is limited. We are talking about approximately 300 polling stations. 3,000 polling stations, of which about half are in the hinterland. You can't hopscotch and monitor all of that. And it's the same thing for observers. You know, you have these large observers who come, but they really, can't monitor station per station in an election where the results are so close. There are gaps. There are gaps. Observers, it's good, but they are not the ultimate solution to our problem. And very often observers are plasters rather than real monitors. I've had the privilege of monitoring elections in Asia and in Latin America, and I've seen how unimpactful observers could be. I remember one instance in Bangladesh where I first monitored the elections, that a cry was raised about corrupt voting going on in a polling station. And we took off to that polling station to see what was happening, to find out later that we were really being distracted to allow corrupt voting in the polling station where we were.
As we head towards September 1, what are some of the statutory timelines or parties should be looking for? Citizens as well.
Nomination day is very critical. It all starts with submission of symbols. So you get symbols first, you get nomination day. The day when there should be claims and objections, so that too should be looked for. The day when the lists should be posted, the day for discipline services voting, those are all critical days that we should be looking towards. So symbols, nominations, posting of the lists, claims and objections, discipline services voting, and ultimately election day itself.
Okay, great. Mr. Alexander, closing remarks.
My closing remarks. My closing remarks goes beyond the conduct of elections. As a person, I'm speaking here personally, I think that elections in Guyana are dysfunctional. They are not responsive to the plural nature of society. They impose majoritarian rule, and therefore we need to address the question of how elections are used to give a truly representative government. And the system we have now, in my humble opinion, is dysfunctional. It is what we have, and therefore those of us who are officers of the state have got to do whatever we can do to make sure what we have is free and fair. But I'm going to be the first person to admit that even in the face of that free and fairness, our elections produces a majoritarian government that does not reflect and or represent the interests of all the people of Guyana. That is what fundamentally we need to fix.
And so there's need for constitutional reform.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much, Mr. Alexander, for being here again with me. And with that, we've come to the end of this edition of Sources. I've been your host, Svetlana Marshall.